Okay. Well, hello everyone and welcome. My name's Steve Berman. I'm the director of the Center for Global Health, and it's really a pleasure to introduce Bruno Sobral, who's the director of the One Health Institute. Bruno's been here 2.5 years now, and at CSU. As most of you know, CSU is an integral part of the School of Public Health. Bruno is And as you'll hear, Bruno has really a multi-dimensional career. And he's professor in the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, Pathology. He straddles many different disciplines, and I think is an ideal person to kind of bring the One Health concept into fruition at CSU. Also, over the last several weeks, Bruno and his team at CSU has been working very closely with our team in the School of Public Health and Center of Global Health in preparing a joint One Health project in Guatemala. So we're really pleased to have you here, and thank you for coming.
So I'm a big fan of Apple. I had the first Macintosh, and I'm really upset at Apple right now because the new Macs are all USB 3, C. And of course that creates these kinds of really interesting presentations. And since I work native in Keynote, not in PowerPoint, I can't just plug it into a PC. So I apologize for the size. Our colleague has helped in every way he can. I would suggest, it's not a coercion, but I would suggest that if your eyes are as old as mine, you might benefit from moving up, because the slides aren't going to get bigger. And most of it isn't tiny, but some of it is, unfortunately. I'll try to walk through it. I'm not going to read everything to you. I'm also happy to leave the presentation behind in case you can't read. So it's an enormous pleasure. As Dr. Berman said, I've been for quite some time trying to figure out and understand. So, I arrived 2.5 years ago. Probably for the first year, I spent almost all my time trying to figure out CSU. Not that I have yet. It's a big organization. But at least to understand sort of the internal milieu so that we could start building the institute, developing the internal strategy. We've got representation and participation from over 25 academic departments across all 8 CSU colleges. And I suspect most of you can understand that to get there, it takes a while, a lot of conversation, explaining why are you in the English department talking about One Health. And so I think, to the credit of my colleagues there, if you spend enough time, people start to see roles. And then once they start to see themselves in a role, things take off, right? Because then it's no longer trying to explain why. It's more like, okay, now how do we do this? So we're very much in the how now. And so I've put this presentation a little bit more around the how, the way of working as opposed to deep science in any particular aspect. I'm happy to take scientific questions that go deeper. Just recognize that, my PhD is microbial genetics. My undergrad is ag engineering. And so beyond that, if you ask other questions, I may have to say, well, I'll have to go ask somebody who knows. But I'm happy to take questions, of course, on any piece of what I present. I think one of the first things about One Health to me, as I've studied the concept and the history, I'm one of those people who, when I dig into a new concept, I get very interested in the history. The words, the history, the meanings, because that helps at least understand how we got to where we are. It doesn't mean that it helps you understand where we're going, but at least you have the context of how we got here. So it's my belief that One Health is what human beings have practiced for most of their existence on Earth all over the world. And the reason I say that is if you look at native cultures, and unfortunately, since most of their histories are oral, and I don't speak any native languages, I have to rely on English translations that I can trust. And what I find is, whether you're in Amazonian tribes, North American tribes, Maori, and others, the concepts around health, I think, are very well represented in this quote. And I won't read to you for the most part, but this one I'd like to read. What is man without the beasts? If all the beasts were gone, men would die from great loneliness of spirit. For whatever happens to beasts also happens to man. All things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the children of the earth. So I would say that until maybe the modern European expansion, this was health. It was just health. And I don't think the Maori were emailing the Yanomami, right? So it just seems that the natural human existence and understanding of health was this whole view of something that's whole, that involves environment, other forms of life, and human beings. And in fact, in Yanomami tradition, there's no such thing as healthiness if anybody's sick. If you're sick, there's no such thing as Bruno is sick. No, we are sick. It may express itself through Bruno. So it's really a very integrated concept, and I would say that that is the native and natural concept of health for humanity. Now, why are we not doing that anymore, and why did we have to, in modernity, come up with this again? Well, it turns out that the sectoralization, disciplinization, and professionalization means that now all knowledge is in pieces, we are in pieces, and we can't see the whole anymore. And even veterinary science, I'm not a veterinarian, really starts with people who took care of horses for royalty. And until that time, we're talking about maybe the last 200 years or so, all physicians handled all animals that showed up. And in fact, as you all probably know better than I do, that comparative physiology, comparative anatomy were key ways in which people have learned about mammals in particular. And there are interesting debates in ancient Greece about whether or not it's okay to dissect animals to learn about humans. And so it really is the last 200 years or so that have led us into the current situation that One Health in modernity seeks to rediscover. So the first thing is now there's a One Health Day. The first one was in 2016. I remember Earth Day. I'll date myself. I remember where I was. I remember the day. And I also remember the famous Hobbes little cartoon. We have seen the enemy. It is us. Now, you could get really depressed about that and say, oh my God, and my dad was an engineer and he used to say, son, world's a beautiful place, it's just people that are no damn good. So, of course, that's the engineering view, and I love my dad, but he did have that canonical engineering view. Everything is messy when you get involved with people. And it's true, we're messy. However, you could also say, if it's us, that means we can change it. So I actually think there's hopefulness. I don't know what Hobbes intended, but I know that I see that as a hopeful. And that day was the day that we opened our doors on November 3rd, 2016. Our president and chancellor, Tony Frank, is a Cubs fan. For those of you who like baseball, I was born in Brazil, so I play football, the one with the round ball, and they kick it. But the night before, if you're a baseball fan, you know what was happening. And so Chancellor Frank was supposed to start this day, and I went to bed. I don't watch baseball. But I went to bed, and I thought, what happens if they lose, or if this thing goes all night, or whatever? Anyway, Chancellor Frank showed up the next day, and we had pictures of the Cubs all over, and yet he gave a wonderful and beautiful talk to open up the One Health Institute. The other thing I want to say there is One Health is a movement. I don't think of One Health as a discipline. And I, in fact, actually think it's just an integrative movement. But I don't mean just in a way to belittle it, but just to say that that's what it is. In some senses, the more modern version, right, the rediscovery of what was always known to be knowledge and truthful before, happens in part through veterinarians, in some senses, working in Africa. So once again, I think that native knowledge infected their way of thinking. And there was a one world movement at about this time as well, which was about all the world is interconnected. And One Medicine was this idea of, well, gee, for most of humanity, medicine has involved animals and humans. We need to put it back together again because our systems are failing in part because of that separation. Now, I'm not arguing or saying that we're going to reintegrate everything into one profession. I'm sure I would be run out of Dodge pretty fast. But the focus of this movement is these, what is known as complexity characterized systems. And these are very different than simple systems or complicated systems. A complicated system, for example, is a Boeing 777, but it's engineered. Going to the moon is complicated, but it's engineered. And complicated systems are very, very different than complex systems. And so in complexity characterized systems, you have lots of feedback loops. There is no linear, useful way of predicting, but there's really great informatics tools nowadays to work with complexity. And just in the last 10 to 20 years, it's possible to do things that you could never have dreamed of doing not so long ago, except in theory. And I think that it's also similar to a lot of other things. Again, these are my opinions. You will find colleagues, One Health is like 31 flavors of ice cream at Baskin-Robbins. There's vanilla, and some people love vanilla. And I don't want to be in an argument that you should love chocolate instead of vanilla. So I actually think that the pluralistic view of One Health is valuable. And I'm not interested personally in having arguments about what are the boundaries and what is a strict definition. But I think it's similar to eco-health, planetary health, global health, sustainable development, regenerative development, conservation medicine, future Earth, and I'll probably stumble over a new one soon. And why I think it's similar is that all of these are trying to struggle with complexity characterized systems and trying to use integration as a way to understand them and intervene in them more effectively. And as I said, there are many flavors, and I think that the key aspect for One Health, in my opinion, the part that I'm not willing to let go of, is that the health of animals, peoples, and places are interdependent. If they are interdependent, they form a complexity characterized system. Breaking them into pieces loses the context and the capability to understand the system. And there are many implementations of One Health, in fact, possibly the majority, that are veterinary science heavy, and they live in vet schools. And in those implementations, often it's a simple renaming of zoonotic infectious disease research. And there's nothing wrong with that. Zoonotic infectious disease research is valuable. However, I think if you still see it from a single sector's lens or a single disciplinary lens, as valuable as veterinary science is, you end up not actually doing anything new and adding new value and new knowledge into the understanding. So at CSU, one of the things I've really loved wasn't my decision. I was just the person they hired to execute it, is to place One Health centrally, reporting to the central administration of the university. Because we all know that if you put something in a college, there's great value because college have power, resources. Central administration often doesn't have the same level of resources. However, it then becomes, oh, well, it's a veterinary science thing. So it's harder to corral people from the other colleges, right? And so I actually think that the strategic location as a central resource is fundamentally important, even though it, of course, comes with a certain set of costs. So, but when it goes into action, what does it look like? Well, it's a bunch of these inter things, and it's intersectoral, it's transdisciplinary, and for me, I know a lot of people feel that multi, inter, and trans are the same thing. Without getting too philosophical about it, I would say they're not, and there's lots of great work at the National Academy of Science and all that explain very deeply what the differences are. So in transdisciplinarity, the new conceptual framework emerges from the integration and going beyond, right, the disciplines. So the first product of transdisciplinary teams is a new conceptual framework that isn't rooted in any discipline. And and you need professionals. So by that I mean you need practitioners. And so we talk a lot about, evidence-based practice. So that's a wonderful thing. Evidence, I think we would all agree, is wonderful. The problem with evidence-based practice, if I say, let's go to the moon, and we've never gone to the moon, well, there's no evidence we can go to the moon. So if there's no evidence we can go to the moon, therefore evidence-based practice keeps me from going to the moon because I can't give you evidence we can get there. So you can make incremental progress with evidence-based practice, but you can't make big jumps because you're always stuck in this place of where is the evidence. But there's also practice-informed, right, evidence. And the idea is to create a virtuous cycle, that the practice informs us, and practitioners have lots of really interesting experiments that they're running all the time with no evidence. Because what? Because they understand the art of the practice. The practice is more art than science often. So you can just say, hey, they're all doing these experiments, let's learn. And then you put in the reflective idea of taking in the evidence from the practice, interpreting it, and then feeding back evidence to support the practice. So that's the idea, I think, that's critical in One Health as well. The other thing is it needs to be sustained. Because if you're going to work in complexity characterized systems that involve human beings, those things my dad said were so difficult, you need to be present, and you need to be trusted, and you need to be seen as something more than drive-by research. And I understand why that happens, right? It's the way we're funded, it's the way we're evaluated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But communities are smart, they have agencies, and most communities kind of are like, what? So you have to be able to sustain in a project-independent way relationships with residents. And place sourcing means that in complexity-characterized systems, the place provides the context. And so that gets to the issue that what might work really well in Belém do Pará in Amazonia may not work at all somewhere else, even though it sounds like the same problem, because the context is different. The cultures are different, the resource base is different, the local environment is different. So that also gets to this issue of scaling, which is a mechanical property, not a complexity characterized property. And so scaling works well for factories and building things like that. It doesn't always work well in complexity characterized systems. Often it's actually quite a problem. When you try to apply what you learned in one place and you don't take deep consideration of the different context, you may actually do a lot of unintended harm. So to lead this kind of work, and by lead, we'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by lead, you need people who are able to form and lead networks of people, I don't mean networks like those, across traditional boundaries that enable both a horizontal flow of knowledge, experience, and also distributed leadership. So it doesn't fit into the nice hierarchical designs of most of our organizations, quite frankly. You need governance and infrastructure. We all know and experience that policies and institutions and rules tend to be unintended barriers to collaboration. More often than not, they have a lot of rational underpinning for why they exist, but that rational underpinning is usually based on the needs of a certain sector or group, or profession or discipline, which then causes unintended difficulties to work together. Things as simple as how do we schedule time together across 8 colleges when each department schedules time as though it exists in a vacuum of the rest of the world? Because why would you ever want to talk to somebody from another department? So you end up with, how do you convene dozens of faculty coming from different places who are interested, who have self-selected to participate, and the only empty time that we could all convene is either Saturday night or Sunday morning, and of course none of us wants to do that. I mean, we might do that once or twice, but we're not going to make that a habit, because we have families and other things to tend to. So that's a simple example, I get it, but you probably have experienced how much of a barrier that is towards collaboration. So you have to spend the time. There's no speed dating in One Health. It's really sort of, and again, I'll date myself, I'm 60. It's more like, first you meet her in the square. In Brazil, the men would walk around this way and the women would walk around this way, and all the uncles and aunts and brothers and sisters were sitting around watching. And in my case, I'm a heterosexual male, so, in those days you'd walk by and then you smiled at her, and next time you came around, did she smile back, and et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to tell the whole story because it'll take forever. And eventually you might speak. And then at some point you might need to go to the house and say, hey, I'd like to take your daughter out or your sister and get permission. This is a long process. And so that's part of what it is. And that's unfunded time, just like writing grants. The time you're writing the grant isn't really funded by any agency, right? You don't write a grant to write a grant, right? Hey, you need to fund my time so I can write this grant. So building partnerships is unfunded time, but it is an antecedent condition without which you can't practice One Health. So that's one of the challenges, organizational challenges, is like, wow, Bruno, you're going to the Amazon again. What do you do there? Do you just sit around and drink coffee and stuff? No, we're building partnerships, and it takes time. It's not speed dating. And so these partnerships, there's all sorts of challenges in building them, right? Like, what? There's territorial, tribal behavior around these things. Like, what? Why are you sticking your toes in my thing, right? That's my thing. Agencies also have those things. I can't tell you how many times in this country I've been working at the federal government level trying to sell a bigger idea that would touch USDA, NIH, and NSF, and they're all telling me, hey, son, get rid of all that stuff. We just care about this thing. Give us one of those. So eventually you learn that your naivete, that somehow magically the federal agencies would just see it and fund it all, is, okay, I have to still develop that, and then I have to figure out how to fund the components without breaking apart my understanding of the whole thing. So it's a challenge, but it can be done intentionally and slowly. And the key players to do that with you, the partners, have to have the willingness, freedom, and capacity to share responsibilities and resources. So again, this term now, multi, which I consider to be, and definitionally is, experts working in isolation in a serial way, is an insufficient model. So, if I want to stay in my lane as a statistician or a microbiologist or whatever, and say, hey, that's all I'm doing, that's a multidisciplinary. It has value. It's useful. For a lot of things, it's perfect. Don't ever make things more messy than they need to be. But for this kind of complexity characterized long-term transdisciplinary activity, it is insufficient. So, the title of the talk is the next thing I want to talk about. So, I think that there is a convergence. For example, the World Bank just published a big, long document that talks about One Health implementation at national levels. And I'm not going to try to tell you everything in the document. But one of the interesting things that they say, among others in that document, is that the manifestation of success of One Health happens through the strengthening of public health systems. For me, public health systems include everything from primary care, mental care, which I think mental health care needs to be part of primary care, and I know that there's strong leadership, national and international, here in Anschutz campus around that theme. And it also needs to be a bringing together of public health, which tends to operate at this level, and how do we tie that into primary care much more effectively to create these incredible feedback loops that one desires. Why? Because usually the relationships with the human beings are held by primary care. Public health has a population view, and we need both. And we actually need to create positive feedback loops between the people who have the relationship with the human beings and people who are looking at the population level. And so that vacuum or gap is one of the other things that I think needs to be filled effectively. So this is a paper in a journal called One Health by a couple of Canadians. Often I find that in the things we're trying to do, the Canadians are way ahead of us. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it seems to be the case often. And so look at the title of this paper, right? There's not a word about infectious diseases or veterinary anything or human medical anything. What it's essentially saying is that without leadership, governance, partnerships, and the competencies to develop those and sustain those, there is no One Health. so that the technical knowledge that people may have about human medicine, environmental health, or veterinary medicine alone is completely insufficient to practice One Health. And here's another paper. And I don't know any of these authors. I know one of the two on the other one. You guys probably know these authors. So I don't have a particular judgment about their viewpoint. But I really like it because in the paper, it calls for the role of chief health strategists in community as one of the key products of Public Health 3.0 education. And even though that term isn't a term I had ever heard of until I read the paper, what they mean is very similar to the same things that are being talked about here. A chief public health strategist embodies leadership, is able to develop governance and partnerships. They have those competencies, which in some senses are non-technical in a traditional sense. In a STEM-oriented sense, they are not technical capabilities. And that paper is pretty recent. So this is a figure from that paper. And this is their terminology, so I'm not here to defend or attack it, the Public Health 1.0, and then they get to the Public Health 3.0. Engage multiple sectors and community partners to generate collective impact. Sounds like the other paper. Same thing. Okay? So it seems like if we're interested in these things, lots of people coming from different areas are converging on the same discovery, which is what is missing? What is missing is the capacity to do that. Okay? What is missing is not more veterinarians and more physicians and more, although we probably don't have enough, especially in rural communities. But that's not the key thing that's missing to make progress in the views of these authors, and I share their view, that where our biggest gap is elsewhere. Oh, and by the way, in this particular paper, they say improve social determinants of health. I like social determinants. I don't have an issue with them. Except that I think that somehow the language around social determinants still has a tendency to pathologize communities. And communities, for me, are filled with opportunity and assets and agency. And so I'm much more of an asset-based community development kind of mentality than, oh, we got to get rid of stuff. So my metaphor for that is I love to garden. I only garden things I eat. I don't know how to garden flowers, even though I love flowers too. Gardening for me is not weed killing, although sometimes I have to get rid of weeds. Why do I garden? I garden because I want to eat that tomato at the end, and I want to pick it fresh out of my backyard. So yeah, in the process of getting to that wonderful tomato, sometimes I weed, sometimes I fertilize, sometimes I get rid of problems that would keep me from the tomato. But if gardening to me were weed killing, I'd not do it. I'm not interested in weed killing. I'm interested in collecting the harvest. So you could think about an idea where, yes, we know there are social determinants of health, but what is our purpose? Is it to eliminate things, or is it to cultivate something like health? So what is the difference between getting rid of things we don't like and cultivating things we like? Well, one of the key differences is it changes how you approach things. That in sort of this will perspective, you're approaching something with hope and desire as opposed to, getting rid of problems that at some point, for me, generates the whack-a-mole problem. So, then there's another one. And I'm really tired, right? Because I don't know what I'm trying to cultivate. I just know what I'm trying to get rid of. And this is probably familiar to you all. I discovered it recently because what I started to find within CSU is, oh, you're talking about like engagement, right? We have, as you guys probably know, CSU as a land grant has an Office of Extension, and Lou Swanson, who's the VP in charge of that, also has an Office of Engagement. And when I got there, I said, hey, Lou, you got Extension, but you got engagement. And Lou will say, I learned from Lou, that you can get to Extension through engagement, but you can't get to engagement through extension. Those are Lou's words. And the first time I heard it, I thought he's joking. And then I thought, oh, I see what you're saying. And so extension, for all of its wonderful achievements, and it has many, and it still has many, is the expert-based model. I'm going to come to town to solve your problems. Well, I tell you, most communities are sort of like, really? So engagement, to me, is a noun. It's important. But what happens before engagement? An invitation. So the quality of the invitation matters. And before engagement, there's an invitation. We need to think about what is the appropriate invitation in the context of a specific community. But this helped me start to create a lexicon on campus that, since it's inherited from CDC, adopted by CDPHE here, I said, hey, I didn't invent it. People have already agreed, much smarter than I. So the other important point about this is that each level has value. So once again, we're not talking about, oh, we all have to give up one thing and start another. That's not the point. It depends on the outcome, right? So if your outcome is to develop connections, what you're interested in is participation, modality, consult. What One Health is interested in is affecting broader community health outcomes. The only one that does that is what they call partnership. What is the key characteristic? Sharing power and resources. So the first grant that we just got funded by CDPHE, actually 60% of the money goes directly into the community. The PI is in the community, and we are 40% and have some really smart people that are deeply community partnered, okay? So the idea that I'm somehow going to do partnership in the community and affect health outcomes if I'm getting 80% of the money to do assessment because I can publish papers and get new grants and further my career, all of which is good, that's something different. It has value, but it's certainly not this, and it's not going to affect broader community health outcomes. So if you're interested in that, then it's pretty clear that a lot of people seem to agree about what to do. Okay, so I've said a bunch of things about leaders. So what kind of leaders suit One Health? So what is meant by lead? Well, if you go back to the roots of the word, it's guiding across boundaries. Okay? Now, we have a problem in the United States where we confuse positional authority and leadership. So just because somebody has positional authority, like, okay, Bruno's the director of the One Health Institute, there's some positional authority. Does that mean I'm a leader? Not necessarily. Leadership is a choice. And anybody can be a leader, a student. Anybody can be a leader. It's a choice to cross boundaries and guide. Okay? Positional authority, on the other hand, doesn't guarantee any leadership skills. In fact, in my life, I've encountered a lot of people with positional authority who I don't think are leaders. That doesn't mean they're not valuable. They may be great managers. But we confuse here what is meant by leadership with positional authority very often. And we have this heropreneur mentality in our country where somehow Steve Jobs magically created Apple. Steve Jobs took great technology from Xerox PARC that was sitting on a shelf, and he did wonderful and amazing things, and so did a bunch of other people that were in his organization. But somehow in our mind, it's like, let's study Steve Jobs, because somehow there's something magical about him. Misunderstands the complexity, characterized nature of building an organization like Apple. Okay? So we give undue attention to people with positional authority and confuse them with leaders. And if you don't believe me, if you think, oh, that sounds a little like, what? Well, there are people who study this. So Dan Stokols, for example, at Irvine, somebody I've communicated a lot with in my own sort of learning about transdisciplinarity. And this is just one paper. I could cite more. Leaders substantially influence collaborative processes and outcomes. If you think that your intentions and your will aren't affecting everybody that you're leading, think again. It is affecting very deeply the outcomes. And even though you may go, well, it's not working because, Bruno's an idiot. We just need to replace Bruno. That's a misunderstanding of why maybe I'm behaving like an idiot might have a lot to do with your leadership. So these recursive loops in human relationships are complex systems. The simplest to explain complex system I can think of is a family. How many of you in your families who probably love each other ever experience unintended consequences and outcomes that nobody wants? Happens in my family. I don't think it's lack of love and caring. right? It has to do with all complex systems produce unintended consequences. All we can do with that is reflect on our own role and change it if we so desire. So this comes from the type of leader, for me, is very well explained by Arthur Kleinman, who's a medical anthropologist, and Ian Wilkinson, who's a sociologist, in this book, A Passion for Society. I'm not going to tell you about the whole book, but basically what they're arguing is that the beginning of social sciences was an ethic to improve society, very practical, and that the retreat of certain social scientists into the ivory towers to study phenomena is an anti-ethical abnormality that needs to be, in their opinion, remediated. So this idea that even some social scientists now just study theory, in their view, is not acceptable. Now, I'm not going to go as far as that, but it's a great read. And the title is very indicative of what they think, which is that the people who come to their calling, or the One Health calling, you kind of have to have a passion for society, because that's what you're going to be working with. So what qualities, more specifically? So once again, leading is stepping across the threshold, and in doing so, letting go of everything that might be limiting you. So in building the fellowship on campus, the big slide on the first meeting of everybody that was interested is, what do you need to let go to be successful in this endeavor? What do you need to leave behind? And that reflection, I think, is an initial critical reflection, because if you're not willing to leave anything behind and everybody else feels the same way, then we're not going to get anywhere. So that willingness to step forward and leave something behind is critical. You have to sustain interprofessional, intersectoral, transdisciplinary engagement, so collective leadership is what matters. If you want to be the next Steve Jobs, it's probably not the right place for you. There are better places for you. Because this is about collective leadership, not about egocentric leadership. 3 core qualities for this have been studied in management sciences, organizational learning, all sorts of things for the last 30, 40 years. This isn't new stuff. Even Deming studied this stuff, that there are 3 core qualities. Ability to see and sense the larger system. So not the pieces, or the piece that I'm supposed to know about as a microbiologist, but the capacity to zoom out and sense the larger interconnected system. That's one of the key 3. The capacity to foster reflection and to have generative conversations. So, are you guys familiar with T-shaped and I-shaped people terminology? Has anybody not heard of that? Okay, so it turns out it comes out of Silicon Valley. Industry, even in Silicon Valley, hires bright people in different sectors, right? We want the best HR director. We want the best financial or COO or whatever. So how do you get to be one of those? Well, you have to express technical proficiency in something. So that's an I-shaped person, because the letter I is very deep but very narrow. Okay? So I-shaped people are great as long as you want to measure performance of their sectors. But the moment you put everybody in the room and you say, hey, we've got this problem, I need all hands on deck, all sectors to participate, a team to emerge, what do I-shaped people typically do? Well, Bruno gives his best idea, and then the next person says, I'm going to tell you all the reasons why that's stupid, and then replace it with my idea. And it just keeps going around and around and around, and everybody attacks everybody else's idea because their idea is better, but their idea is usually rooted in their base knowledge. And so the rejection of the other idea isn't personal. It's just like, I can't understand that because that's not my expertise, so I better not let that idea get ahead, because then what's my role? So we kind of, as I-shaped people, keep destroying other ideas, and we never get to solutions across teams. T has a bridge piece. What are the key qualities of T-shaped people? Empathetic listening, or listening, deep listening and reflection, empathy, and the capacity to build on other ideas instead of rejecting them. So you hear Bruno's idea, hey, I really like this, this, and the other. If we added this, what do you think? And then the next person, and pretty soon we got this big construct that is merging ideas and creativity, as opposed to this constant argument of deconstructing each other's ideas. So that's the second key quality. And the last one is to shift collective focus from reactive problem solving, whack-a-mole, to co-creating the future, looking at the regenerative potential of the assets and agency of any community as the way to start. And so those are the three key principles, and they happen to be the three principles of the One Health Institute. This is our little, we had a 2-day, very long workshop with a retreat, couldn't bring your cell phones. Over 70 people participated in January of 2016 to found sort of the core concepts, purpose, and all of the One Health Institute. Create Futures We Desire, which is kind of like communities creating health or communities cultivating health. This is a slightly different take on the Folsom Report's Communities of Solution, but it's that flip from trying to solve problems to creating and cultivating what we seek to have. See the whole system, systems thinking. Collaborate across boundaries. If you're a D-School IDEO sort of person, you know that there's a methodology called design thinking that allows collaboration across boundaries in a rapid prototyping sort of way, right? We learn by doing and by having a team that involves, in a very big way, the people most impacted by the potential decisions. They have to have a lot of say in what's going to happen. So that's the Institute, and then we created these three sort of programmatic or thematic areas because I don't want to always explain to people what One Health is. Agencies can fund those and they can understand those much more easily than One Health. So even though we know that that's a whole system, that those boundaries are artificial, there are ways to create impedance match with external funders. Because very few people actually want to fund One Health. And then what is meant by One Health research? Well, here's the traditional model. Gowns come to town to solve the problems. Right? Mainstream institutional knowledge trumps all other forms of knowledge. Right? All other forms of knowledge are not scientific in our minds, and therefore are useless and need to be replaced by our knowledge. Well, there are other ways of doing this. And so the pedagogy of people like Paulo Freire and various others really talks about, and there is practice around this and lots of results out in the world, where experiential knowledge, community knowledge, and mainstream institutional knowledge can be commingled, and I would say that that is much more effective. If nothing else, it recognizes the agency and wisdom of everyday people in ways that are crucial, and I would say it's even an existential threat to academia to continue this way. You probably read recently that over 50% of Americans now think higher education is dangerous. It's not just that it's not any good, it's dangerous. It's a menace to society. And by the way, if you're going to say, oh yeah, that's just because one party thinks that. Nope, there's about 20-odd% of Democrats who are also voting that way. So if we really want to continue this way, we'll just get less and less relevant. And people won't come. They won't send their kids. It's expensive. Why am I sending my kid to a dangerous place at a high cost? So there's methodologies, tools, and rigor around the other one. And that's the One Health sweet spot. Okay, so great. So let's talk about real-world examples for a minute. And I'm not going to give a lot because we don't have a lot of time, but I could give many. This one is one of my favorites. Look at that. It's interdisciplinary. It's longitudinal, multiple domains over 10 years. Mixed, so time, it's not a 1-year project or a 3-year project. Don't expect to see a lot of progress in quarterly thinking, right? Quarterly thinking is going to kill you from doing anything interesting because in a quarter you haven't seen progress. So, okay, there's no progress, so we've got to pack it up and go away. Mixed methods, community-based, resident researchers, community organizations, the democratization of science and the notion that every 5-year-old is actually a scientist until we put them in the educational system is true. It's just natural and native. And this is a partnership between the Massachusetts Investment Corporation, conservation law firm, and the academics are the Community Innovation Lab at MIT. Okay? And their whole thing is, first they created a huge fund because who funds this? So they already understand that part of the problem is the funding model. So if we're going to do these things, we have to change the funding model. So they created a funding model. That's where they started. So the structure of the funding model is that it has over 30 million quadruple bottom line private equity fund investors. And this is exactly designed to meet the need for patient lower cost, long-term equity capital. Return rates for those investors are 6 to 8% over the life of the fund. The term of investment is 10 years, and there's a 2% management fee, and that's the structure over there. I'm sorry that this one is small, but I read to you kind of what's in there. And the way they deal with that is they mix capital. So there's philanthropic capital mixed in with capital that wants to make market returns. And then when they underperform, they essentially, first of all, for the philanthropic guys, say, sorry, no return. They were like, okay, that's fine. We didn't expect a return. We're interested in the social impact. Then there are people in the middle who are happy with lower than market returns because they care about social impact. And then there are people who are like, nope, I want my money. But they blend them all, and so they have a way to ensure success for everybody. Well, that's really creative thinking. And this is just a little wheel of how it happens, right? The different things they're investing in. They've developed metrics at the start, right? So that it doesn't be like, well, it sounds good, but it doesn't work, right? So you can't read all those, but there are a number of metrics here to do with health outcomes. This is at the neighborhood level in the city of Boston. Has to do with life expectancy, all sorts of things that you could imagine. And they have this kind of understanding that this thing just keeps going around and you keep learning more and more by doing. And the reason that matters, and I think this isn't news to any of you, is that even though I'm a card-carrying geneticist, zip code is going to tell you a lot more about how healthy you are than sequencing my genome. Right? I'm a card-carrying geneticist, so I can say disparaging things about geneticists. I love genetics. It's fun. I have a great time solving really interesting genetic puzzles. But if I want to do something about health, that's not where I'm starting at all. That's not. I don't do anything with genetics nowadays except a little bit of microbial genetics because I'm committed to that. And Anthony Eaton in the California Endowment has said that, and by the way, the endowment has put over $1 billion into these things in California, so they're not just saying it, they're doing it. And what you don't see up there is in the same area, general area of the town of Boston, if you're in that upper place, your life expectancy is almost 92 years, which is above average, but if you're in that other place, just a couple miles away, it's worse than Iraq. So I don't think that's genetics, right? It would be hard for me to come up with a reasonable argument that that has much to do with genetics. But if you're going to go down this path, what happens to the faculty who participate? Uh-oh, trouble. How am I going to get tenure? Right? I mean, nobody's measuring these. But it turns out that at CSU, we have a provost who's deeply committed. There is a provost council on what they call community engaged scholarship. And you can't read any of those, but basically there's community-engaged research, community-engaged creative activity, community-engaged teaching, and community-engaged service. And then there are examples of artifacts that count for assessment of faculty. So we don't have to invent it. All of the things that you can't read that are in bullets are things that One Health will manifest if it does its work well. So now we've got to make sure that those are actually in the departmental codes. Because it's one thing for the provost to say it, it's a different thing for the department to adopt it. But that is exactly the route through which we would assess work in One Health. That doesn't mean that the assessment that would normally apply in your home department, because nobody at One Health is full-time, aren't valuable. Of course they're valuable, and of course you need to meet those. But if you choose to participate in One Health, the assessment of your One Health time is this model. The last thing I want to talk about for a second, how many of you are familiar with this iceberg model of reality? Anybody not familiar? Okay, so you've seen this before, that the deepest things are here, but the things we see are only above water, right? The iceberg. Well, it turns out that neuroscience has discovered a bunch of really interesting things that I think substantiate this very deeply. Lisa Barrett Feldman's work, which is embodied in the book, How Emotions Are Made, is completely turning the understanding of neuroscience on its head, in my opinion. We all walk through life thinking that what we have on top of our head is a projector that illuminates reality. Now, if that were true, that means your projector is illuminating the same thing as my projector. But what Lisa Barrett Feldman is saying, and backing up with hardcore data of all sorts, is no, it's actually a movie that's based on what you think, right? And that means my projector and your projector are showing completely different realities. They're more similar if we've grown up drinking the same water, sniffing the same air, living in the same community. But the moment that starts to diverge, all bets are off. The reality that you believe is real is completely different in some cases than the reality that somebody else believes is real. And that's not saying that there isn't something real somewhere, but what it is saying is that to the extent that we share our understanding of reality, it is a collective hallucination. Hardcore in her book. Why does that matter? Well, she got interviewed recently, and what she said is, according to the theory I've introduced, it makes clear that humans are a social species, which means we regulate each other's nervous systems. I can make your heart rate speed up or slow down just by my choice of words. Something I have a particular interest in is that in the United States, there's a problem with the casual brutality of social interactions. That doesn't exist everywhere, by the way. For example, in US schools, bullying is an accepted way of life. I believe it takes its toll in a really specific way. If you're spending all of your time in an environment that's socially harsh, you don't have the resources to take risks and fail academically. Remember, she's talking about schools. Which is exactly what we need you to want to do to create innovation and a creative workforce. But because you're completely under siege all the time and scared, your mind is distracted and all of your processing is around being safe. Now, you can imagine how that plays out beyond schools, right? Depending on which communities you're living in nowadays, ICE might be knocking at your door. So if you think this has no impact, including in your physical health, think again. So I think we're affecting brain development in a way that's going to impact society. The emotional climate of a culture is something we should be having very serious conversations about. I would like to bring that dialogue to the public. I haven't quite figured out how, but I want to connect these ideas to biology to show why this is plausible. So, using the iceberg model of reality, this is traditional health science research, has value. I'm not arguing in any way that this is not good. I'm just saying all of our investment is here, where attention is to parts, awareness is of symptoms. We have reactionist science and mechanistic thinking. Reactionist in the sense, what's the problem to solve? Discipline-based research focused on treating specific illnesses. Diseases and illnesses are seen as symptoms to be cured. And the tip of the iceberg is disease treatment. So our healthcare system is that, right? It's disease treatment. Well, in the One Health approach, what we're saying is attention to whole, right? Awareness of root causes and potential. Complexity, living systems, and systemic thinking. There's theory and rigor behind all of these. Transdisciplinary research, whole learning communities, systems-based science. Health is seen as an issue of adapting to challenges. So I could say, for example, that getting overweight might be a healthy adaptation to a particular form of lifestyle, which includes food supply, psychosocial stress, and a number of other things like that. So if I want to affect something about that, where is the deepest lever to affect? Interesting question. So what you see at the top then is creating health. And you can create health. The original term health comes from Germanic, and it means whole. And that's what One Health means, whole, again. So health is nothing other than wholeness, which systems theory is all about understanding how complex systems who are whole are interacting both internally and with their external environment. So in summary, One Health is a global movement. I think if we want to build healthy futures, we're going to have to recognize that most of our challenges are embedded as complex adaptive systems, and we're the actors. We're the ones with the levers. So it's actually what's happening today is the system as designed, producing exactly what it's designed to do, right? Now, there's no magic puppeteer designing, it's all of us. We're all designing and maintaining the system in its current form. Treating complex systems as simple systems, reduction to models, or as complicated systems is ineffective at best because you lose the context, you don't understand the feedback loops anymore, but often it's actually harmful because of unintended consequences. So a simple way to make Fort Collins healthier is let's get rid of all the unhealthy people through gentrification. Zip code will be healthy. Problem solved. Where do they go, though? They go somewhere else. Somewhere else is, you're essentially externalizing unhealthiness and putting it somewhere else. And those feedback loops will come back to bite you because things are connected. So, finally, One Health Institute's principles guide our purpose and are embodied, you saw them as foundational in all of our programs. The way we learn from all projects and programs is that we sit on the foundation of the same principles. And that's communities creating health. So our tagline is we're for health, not against disease. I'm glad there are people who are against disease, by the way. I'd be blind. I've had retinal tears, retinal surgery. I'd be blind today if there weren't people working on it. So there's value. My point is we're not invested enough in being for health. And I think that's what One Health is about. Systems thinking, we work with the whole instead of the parts. We actually embrace and love that it's complex. We actually think that that's the beauty. And then collaborate across boundaries. We do things as communities, which is why being place-based matters in the long haul, not in a project-dependent way. Because if it's in a project-dependent way, you're doing things to communities. We need to be part of the community that we're acting on to be effective. So that's basically the final point I'll say is because we're in Aurora, which is close to Denver, CSU is involved in this big stock center, Globeville, Elyria, Swansea, all these redevelopment activities. And there's this great and wonderful kind of like health impact assessment, neighborhood planning document that I've read. There are many others, very professionally produced, probably by some wonderful people. But the community voice says something different. That one there says, well, we need more parks, we need better sidewalks, we need lighting, we need I don't know what, a bunch of stuff that's sensible. Community saying, our number one thing is don't kick us out. So are we going to meet them there, or are we going to say, hey, have more parks? By the way, you won't be here for those parks. So what is the problem that we want to work on, if you want to call it a problem, or what is the way you want to engage with the human beings that live and work here? Do you want to hear their story, connect with it, or do you want to say, hey, I know we need more parks, don't talk to me about that other stuff. I'm the park guy. I'll give you parks. So I think that's a critical sort of internal and sociological decision that has to be made. And we seek the people who love to work on, no matter what gets thrown at them, in engaging communities, what matters to them. So thank you very much. Be happy to take any questions or have a conversation or whatever. Yes. Should I just pick? I'll pick randomly. Here you go.
Again, okay. I love the idea of this open, transdisciplinary approach, and One Health certainly is that. What is missing in the way we train our students and people to become those leaders of tomorrow? Because we certainly are doing it now. You must have had some thoughts.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts. Some of them may be useful at times, but so, the current educational system you probably all know, and let's go back to grade school to get started. Why is there grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, anybody? Well, the current educational system was designed to produce factory workers. So if you got grade 1, you could do certain types of work. grade 2, etc. So if you have an educational system that is producing human machines to do work in a factory, it's pretty clear what they need to learn, right? I think the purpose of education is to support creativity and creative thinking. But in doing the system that we currently have, I think Peter Senge has this great video that you can find. I think it's a YouTube video. First graders doing systems thinking. So Peter Senge would say, and Peter Senge is the founder of the Society for Organizational Learning, the author of The Fifth Discipline, great read. He says we are all systems thinkers until we hit the educational system and then they beat it out of us. So we have to be self-reflective, right? If it's true, and you could argue that it's not, and that would be fine, that what we want are creative thinkers, the kinds of people who can do the kinds of things that I was describing, that the Public Health 3.0 was describing, that the One Health paper by Craig was describing. We have to think about what is needed for somebody to be creative. So part of it has to do with Lisa Federman's comments. You know, the discourse can't be oppressive. The system of education being oppressive and putting you under constant psychosocial stress is not helpful. Because all of that is taxing your ability to be creative because all of the time you're trying to stay safe and not get run over or killed or denied tenure or, you know, whatever it is, not get sixth grade or flee from the bullies or, you know, whatever it is. So I think that we have to take seriously the points that Lisa makes, which are general societal points, but we also have to understand that if the role is creativity, we have to kind of get off of the idea that I am the, you know, it's kind of like the how do you come into the community? If you think that the student is an empty vessel that your job is to fill, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. If you think of them as huge creative potential, then you have to approach them as that, not as an authoritarian, you need to learn the stuff that I struggled to learn. So those are just general comments, but I think we need to really think seriously about our educational system. And I wouldn't wait until they're in the School of Public Health. I'd be going to K through 12.
Well, first of all, thank you for talking. Especially within our group, we really value, you know, when you hear somebody talk that speaks to a message that you agree with, it's always
easier.
And I'm sick, so I'm sorry that we're all sick. But you know, so I actually teach some of the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary courses that operate both within the School of Public Health here and at CSU.
Excellent.
And have a couple new courses. And so I think that particular message that woman brought up, and also what you're speaking to, I think things that we try to embody. And one of the so one I think is what sort of structured and unstructured student experiences can we cultivate that really address building empathy, community, partnerships, knowledge transfer, communication, and humility within our students, because those things are not just inherent skills or qualities that students have. So, you know, that's what we develop both learning outcomes and objectives for in our courses that address some of those, we call them soft things. I call them pertinent things to the One Health model.
Yeah.
Well,
I very much...
Comments and questions.
Yeah, no. Thank you for both being here and identifying yourself in that way. It's obviously very vulnerable if you're an engineer and geneticist to get up here and talk about these other things, but I've given that up a long time ago. Being vulnerable is fine with me. But to your point, you know, I think what the learnings that I have both had in my own life, but also through studying, and I see a lot of yearning in the students, by the way, and it's not just at CSU. You know, when I come and give a talk like this in somebody's normal lecture where they say, "Hey, come tell the students a little bit about One Health," the students are all at the end like, "Can I go do that right now?"
Yeah, exactly.
When I was in Para recently with a class of 600 medical students at the university there in the medical school, after I gave this talk, they were like, "We don't have time for any of the things you're talking about. We can't even see patients. All we do is test, lecture." Like, now I got a degree. I know it's rough. I'm not trying to say we should, you know, just kind of be lax, but you don't have to be all in classroom and all. I mean, our educational system teaches people to test at all sorts of levels. This kind of stuff, I think you need an experiential loop And you need time for reflection and creativity, right? So it's not like I'm going to dump on you all the learnings and then go out and do it. It's like, I'm going to give you a general framework, and then we're going to go out and learn together. And you have to be humble as a teacher, as opposed to feeling like you have to be the expert. Because otherwise you're going to be very staying in the little box where you're an expert. So you have to be willing to learn as a teacher, including from the students. And I think they have to get out of the ivory towers if you're going to do this kind of work. There has to be significant experiential learning included with the other forms of learning.
And one of the first things on day one, we oftentimes talk about is bringing the beginner's mind to, to the courses that we're teaching around interdisciplinary education and collaboration and research. And I think, that seems to resonate with a lot of people, is that it doesn't matter who you are. If you approach a problem with this mindset, you're going to be more successful.
In my life, when I was studying for PhD prelims, I went and I taught for 4 semesters, even though I was an RA, and my boss, my mentor, kept saying, you don't have to teach. You're like an RA. Get in the lab. And I'm like, how am I ever going to be ready for prelims? And he says, well, you study. And I said, the only way to really study something is to have to teach it. So I would say, ask your student to teach you something, and you'll know how much they've learned. But give them the latitude to learn it. Instead of, here, take it, memorize it, bring it back, and there will be a test Monday. I mean, I know I'm being a little bit simplistic about the words that I'm using here. I know it's not that. But I think that's the key, and the beginner mind has to exist with the teacher, not just with the student.
Bruno,
Yep.
thanks so
Thank you.
much. Well, I want to be respectful of people's
Yes.
time. I think Bruno may have some time if you want to come up and talk some more with him, but I just know that we're 10 minutes over, and I just want to be respectful of your
Yeah.
time.
Thank you.
So, Bruno, thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah. I added some stuff. Actually, the workforce.